All right, we're back, and today we are talking about the Reconstruction Era Amendments. Um, the Civil War is over, and now we've got to really decide how we're going to put the country back together. One of the big things that takes place in the Reconstruction is the passage of amendments. But the Reconstruction era itself is going to be this uh, huge battle, right? It's a battle for control about what the Union is going to look like when it is put back together. It's a battle between North and South. It's a battle between the president and Congress. Who's going to have power? Who's going to have authority? And so in this back and forth, what we're going to see is that when Congress takes control, when they decide that Reconstruction is going to be our purview, that happens after the death of Lincoln, and once they discover that Andrew Johnson, is ineffective and kind of not pulling in the same direction as them, they kind of fully take over. And what we're going to see is that they begin to force the passage of a number of different amendments. The first of which is the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment is the one that bans slavery in the United States, gets rid of it for good. And the way they're able to pass this is they basically make it a condition for readmittance. Right? For Southern states, if they want to come back into the Union, there are certain conditions that they're going to have to meet. And one of them is they have to pass the 13th Amendment. So this has wide support in the North, and Southern states must accept this if they want readmittance. Now they've been conquered, right? So you say, well, yeah, but if they don't want it, why would they? Why would they? Go ahead and do that? And the answer is if they don't become states, if then basically they don't get any congressional representation, they don't get any say in Congress. So they've been defeated, they've been conquered. But now, in order to gain any political power, they have to play ball in Congress. In order to do that, they have to pass the 13th Amendment. So that's the first big hurdle. Now, the next thing that we're going to see is the 14th Amendment, and that takes place a little while later. Ultimately, it extends citizenship to all people born on U.S. soil, including former slaves. This one is one that they really were pushing. In fact, they had passed other bills, but they were afraid. Now, these are the radical Republicans that are pushing this, right? And and they had passed it into law, but they were worried. What happens when maybe the Democrats eventually, because we know that pendulum swings back and forth, what happens when the Democrats gain a majority in Congress? It may not be for 10 or 20 or 50 years, but at some point they could regain control of Congress. And if they regain control of Congress, can they get rid of those laws? And the answer is yes, they could, right? So, what's more permanent than a simple law? And that would be an amendment to a constitution. And so they push really hard. Now, this is before all of the southern states gain readmittance, so they don't necessarily need, all of the southern states because they're not yet states again. They don't necessarily need all of their approval, but they do push this through. It's a fairly popular thing, especially considering it has the support of immigrant communities, because that means that the children of immigrants born on U.S. soil will also get to vote. Anybody born on U.S. soil is a citizen. So while the 13th is about freedom of the slaves, the 14th is about citizenship. Now, the 14th is also very important because it requires all citizens to have equal protection under the law. That means that you can't discriminate. You can't have one set of laws that applies to whites and one set that applies to African Americans or immigrants or whatever the demographic is, right? It has to be equal protection. So the 14th has become really one of the most important of the amendments for that very reason. And it doesn't matter if it's black or white or LGBT or a religious minority or any of these different kinds of things. All citizens get equal protection under the law according to the 14th Amendment. Now, the next one that we see, this is really a big one, and that's the 15th Amendment. And it extends voting rights, regardless of citizenship, or excuse me, regardless of ethnicity or race. And this one was pretty controversial. It's one thing to say, okay, we're going to free the slaves. It's one thing to be abolitionist. It's another thing to be, not racist. And ultimately, that idea is going pretty far, even for places in the North. they weren't entirely sure they wanted African Americans voting, these free slaves or freedmen, because, well, they didn't have any education. How could they possibly cast an educated vote? How can they participate in a democracy like ours without being able to educate themselves on things and without the ability to read? How can they do that, right? And so this is really a very controversial one, and the radical Republicans rallied around it. They pushed it. However, it was not the most popular thing with the public. So they get it done, but because it was so unpopular, they really had to force it through. Now, this is kind of an interesting deal because ultimately the passage of this was so unpopular that it cost them power in Congress. In the next election, this was one of the major themes. People began to vote against the radical Republicans as a way of punishing them for the 15th Amendment. So it does get ratified, and they do get what they want, and that is a voting rights amendment, but at the expense of their own power. Now, to me, this makes the radical Republicans that much more important and that much more impressive in my eyes, because politicians rarely do anything that's going to cost them. They don't want to do anything that's controversial. They don't want to do anything that's going to cost them their seat or give their opponent a something to run on against them, right? Anything to throw mud on them. And so the fact that they knew it was unpopular, but they felt like it was important enough to go ahead and pass anyway speaks volumes of Thaddeus Stevens and the rest of the radical Republicans that saw it as important enough to do it anyway. That is something that we just simply don't see in politics today. This is important enough that they're going to do it, even though they believe it's going to cost them. And it does, right? And so what we're going to see is these three very important amendments. But we have to understand that there is passing the amendments is fantastic, and they wind up being very important amendments. But there is oftentimes a difference between passing laws and enforcing laws. The enforcement is going to be the hardest part of this thing. And ultimately, what we're going to see is that in many cases, they really are just broadly ignored. The idea of the 14th Amendment and equal representation under the law and equal enforcement of the laws is a joke in the South. So for many years, we have these amendments which are phenomenal, but maybe our enforcement of it is pretty lax. There are many different reasons for that, but ultimately, this is what kind of the whole idea of the civil rights movement is built upon. It's uh, the unequal protection of those rights. So anyway, we're making progress. We're taking steps. We're doing the right things in amending the Constitution to allow for more equality, but we've not yet kind of gained that enforcement part of it. So anyway, that's the Reconstruction Era Amendments. Hopefully you learned something. These are very important to all of us as they're part of our Constitution today. But I thank you guys for watching. Go ahead and subscribe. Leave me any comments. There's a lot of room for comments on here because this is a huge topic. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. Thanks.